Welcome to the All Out Leadership Podcast, hosted by Pastor Eric Lawson, where each episode is uniquely designed to help you live all out by bringing you practical leadership from a biblical perspective delivered in 10 minutes or less. So whether you're a business leader, serving in ministry, or simply looking to grow in your leadership, this podcast is for you. Before we dive into this week's topic, make sure to subscribe to the podcast and download the show notes at ericlawson.com/podcast. And while you're at it, feel free to share the content on social media. Now, let's join Pastor Eric for this week's conversation.
Welcome to another edition of the All Out Leadership Podcast. So glad you're joining us. If you have been enjoying these, if they've been helping you in any way, do us a favor, forward it to some friends, family members, colleagues that you think would benefit from this podcast as well. Pay it forward and share it with others. We are looking at the success that David achieved and the dangers that often happen when we get successful, when we reach that rung of the ladder, when we attain that goal. We actually are in a very dangerous position because often yesterday's success leads to today's failure. We don't want to just be a success. We want to stay a success. We don't want to get, quote, to the top. We want to stay at the top of our game. And so we saw that David, when he had been given a time of rest, the first thing that he did is he kept his heart towards God. A lot of people, when they reach certain success, they drift from God. They now have money. They go to the lake. They're on their ski-doos. They're always traveling, and they don't have time for God. But they're using the very thing God gave them to take them from God. And David didn't do that. He actually put his heart towards God, to building God's house. We looked at that. We're going to look at two more aspects of the enemies that could happen to the success God gives us. 2 Samuel chapter 8 and verse 1. After this, it came to pass that David attacked the Philistines and subdued them, and David took Metheg Aham from the hand of the Philistines. Then he defeated Moab. What we see here is David didn't just settle and wait for the battles to come to him. He understood that if he allowed complacency, he would lose his edge, he would become dull, and he would become vulnerable to attack. And so what David did is he didn't wait for the battle to come to him. He went and found that next battle that needed to be fought, and he went proactive rather than be reactive. Statistics show that there's only been 7 NFL teams that have won back-to-back Super Bowls that are repeats. When you look at the total of Super Bowl victories, that's less than 25% of teams repeat. Why is that? Because often today's success is tomorrow's failure. It's very, very hard to continue the momentum and doing what you did to get you here. Once we get there, we just want to go, and we want to rest. In fact, in ancient Chinese warfare culture, there was a tactic that they would use that we would just summarize as the tactic of complacency. When they wanted to take a specific area, often what they would do is, rather than having many different skirmishes with that area, that territory, that enemy, they would actually allow that enemy to prosper. They would leave them alone. They would allow them to succeed. And here's what would happen. Their troops would get complacent. They would stop training. They would stop being disciplined. And often they would wait years for their enemy to reach that state of complacency. Then they would come in completely unexpected, and it was a powerful tactic. Satan does the exact same thing with us spiritually. It happens in terms of our competition. There's a great book by Jim Collins. If you haven't read it, highly recommend it. It's called How the Mighty Fall by Jim Collins, How the Mighty Fall. I'm going to give you just a couple teasers this week, next week from the book. Hopefully it'll entice you to read it if you haven't. It's a must read for every CEO, for every business leader. It's an excellent book. But he talks about the 5 stages of decline. And stage number 1 is hubris born of success. When we reach success, we become highly successful. We reach the top of the game. We're out beating our competition, whatever it might be that we define success is. What happens is companies rest on that, and then they get a sense of entitlement. Well, we've always been a winning team. We've always reached our goals. We've always exceeded our KPIs. And then what happens? Complacency settles in, and then it's the beginning of the stage of decline. I like this statement that he said, we're successful because we do certain things rather than we're successful because we understand why we do those certain things and understand when they no longer work. It's not, hey, we're entitled to success because we got the best product or we got the best service and this is what makes us a success. An entitlement comes out of that. What I like that he emphasized here, it's not knowing what you do, it's knowing why you do it and knowing when it no longer works. But if you're complacent, we lose that competitive advantage of asking why and what do we constantly need to change. David didn't do that. What he did is he identified certain threats that were going to be future battles, and he fought those now before the enemy was able to regroup, before the enemy was able to grow, and before the enemy was potentially going to become undefeatable. How often do we know in our church culture or maybe your business culture with your team, these little threats, these little culture drifts, these little whisperings, these little things that you go, it's not a crisis today, but you know what? If you leave it long enough, it will be a crisis tomorrow. What we see with David is he didn't do that. He didn't let the little things grow into big battles. He nipped it in the bud, as they might say in the South. And so it's very important that when you smell these things, hear these things, that you discern what you need to deal with. In fact, yesterday, I just caught wind of a little something. I just smelt something was a little off. And I go, you know what? I'm not going to wait to find out. I'm going to go investigate. I'm going to ask some questions. I'm going to do some research to help nip this thing in the bud before it grows into something great. That is a leader's job. We can enjoy success. You should take your vacations. You should take your rests. We need to do that. But remember, you need to come back. You need to get your game back on because while you're resting, remember, the enemy's regrouping. While we're at the parties, the enemy's plotting. And so today's success can become the greatest threat to tomorrow's success if we allow ourselves to get complacent. I like what the U.S. Army's posture, they posted as a statement in 2017. The United States Army said this: "We cannot become complacent, remain static, and look to the past or to the present to guarantee our future victory." And that is one of the reasons I think we have the greatest army in the whole world today, is as long as we keep that competitive edge of always striving to become better, celebrate where you are, celebrate your wins, but ask, what's the next step? What do we need to do to continue to become better? What's that battle that's lingering out there that might be better to go ahead, take the enemy by surprise, and fight it today? Next week, we're going to go ahead and look at stage 2 of decline. See you next week.
Thank you for joining us on the All Out Leadership Podcast. We hope you gained new biblical insight that challenged you to grow in your leadership. If you've enjoyed this week's episode, we would love your help in getting the content out farther. You can help by subscribing to the podcast at eriklawson.com/podcast and telling others about it. Next week, Pastor Eric will be back with another episode. So until then, we hope you have a great week being an all-out leader.